Hey, welcome to Debut Interview Series. I'm Dr. Kevin Cordi, and if you don't know what debut is, you need to listen close because the word is spreading. It's where we take three amazing storytellers who tell a story for the first time ever to you, for you, and then we play with the story direction. And I am so excited to have this next storyteller that's agreed to be on our interview series. This storyteller is a Columbia bilingual storytelling performer, podcaster, and author. Graduated in 2013 from the program at East Tennessee State University. Rumor has it, I also attended the graduate program of storytelling. She's performed at several regional festivals and conferences in Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Colorado, and Kansas City. That's what's on print. Let me tell you about this teller. This teller has a commanding presence when she tells stories. You know, when you're listening to a teller who can make the world stop so that we can see the world that she creates, this is that teller. In addition to that, she has a passion for telling stories about the areas around her country and even advocacy. She's a good friend, colleague, and always has a tale to tell. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a deep and rich honor to bring to you Carolina Quiroga. Carolina, good to see you.
Hey, Kevin. Good to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being on debut. We so appreciate it. The first question that I always ask in some way, how did you find story, or story find you?
That's a good question. I would say it's both, because a lot of times I find the stories in books. Most of the time, there's a couple that actually were told by my mom, but most of the time I find them in books, not necessarily explicitly like the story is right there written in the book. Sometimes just something that is in the book leads you to go to another part and research and then go to another one and then you start putting it all together, the puzzle. But it's I feel that sometimes you may read the whole book and only just one thing catches your attention. So when that thing, that little story, that line, or that character catches your attention, that's when the story is talking to you and you are definitely listening or connecting. And that's how I find a story, because then I follow the character and I want to know more about him, and I research and I find this. So a lot of my stories don't actually come exactly from one page in a book. It is a lot of research from here. There is like a detective. That's how I feel. I feel like a detective. Um, I suppose that some detectives are more drawn to certain crimes. I suppose. In my case, it's just the same. I'm just more drawn to certain characters or things that happened, and then I just want to know more, and then I start piecing it out. And so it's probably both. The story's talking to me, or the crime scene, I suppose. I don't know how to call it, but it's talking to me and say, "Hey, solve me, tell me."
Yeah.
And I'm the one saying, "You know what? You seem pretty interesting, and yeah, I feel like I can talk about you."
So I love it. I used to have a T-shirt that says "Discovery over correctness." When I was co-director for the writing project at the Ohio State University, and we would talk about that, the whole idea of a detective looking for story. And so you said stories in books. Rafe Martin once said, and you may know Rafe's work. He has some amazing stuff, and he borrows a lot from Zen and storytelling. He said, stories are trapped in books. It is the storyteller who sets them free. So I think of what you just said. Can you give us an example of a discovery moment when you're reading a story? And I love that you read multiple representations, which, because they're calling out to you.
Let's see. There's a story that is not the one I'm bringing to debut, although that is actually an amazing one. But there is a story that I once found in a book of folk tales about Mexico. And it's in the book is called The Tree of White Flowers. And I found the story and I thought, oh my gosh, this is a really sweet, romantic story. And I don't really like love stories. I'm not a
Don't
fan
tell
of
your
romantic.
husband.
Yes. No, I mean, we actually have a joke because I always told my husband I never wanted to meet Prince Charming. If any of you have read the comic books Fables, you will know that Prince Charming is a horrible human fable character. So I always said I prefer Prince Harming. And so that's the joke that my husband and I have, that he's my Prince Harming, because the Prince Charming never really turns out charming. Is like the charm is just to seduce the girl, and then after that he shows his not very charming ways. But anyway, so I'm never really been a fan of love stories that much, but I know people like them. And so when I selected that story, I thought this could be feel a void there, because I don't have many love stories. I probably just have one, and it's kind of tragic. So I do love tragedies. But then I decided, I asked myself a question: is this real? I mean, this story really happened, or like did she just kind of made it up, like the person that collected the story? And so I decided to research, and it turned out that it had actually happened. It was a historical story that
Ah,
happened in a culture, the Zapotec people, and the Aztecs. So it was a story that historically happened right before Hernan Cortez came to Mexico. And I researched, and I ended up reading a bunch of really old books, and then I was like, no, this is not a romance story. This is a spy story. And that's when it got me. I was like, I mean, you always see spy movies, and they're very thrilling, and people are drawn to, Mission Impossible and all the kind. Everybody loves spies, right? It's like we all want to be a spy too. They have such a glamorous life and so intriguing and hiding in the shadows and all that. But then I was thinking, do Latin American or pre-Columbian Latin America have any, like that type of stories that are kind of exciting, spy, and there's a lot of plotting, and like, I don't know, like Shakespeare type of stories, right?
oh, sure. Yeah.
And then and when I found that one, I was like, oh, I found my gem. And so it took me about 6 months to piece it together. uh, because although because the funny thing about it is that it was, over time, it was turning to just a folktale, and it's actually a political spy love story that did happen. And I don't get enough telling it, and when I tell it, people, you should see their faces. I mean, they laugh, but at the same time it's like and then it really feels like a spy story, because there's war and there's plotting, and there's all these characters that are political characters, like the typical political presidents of these days. So anyway, I mean, to me, that was a story that kind of represents a lot of how I find or build or construct the stories. I try not to believe immediately what I read. I leave questions. Is this real? Does this really happen? Is the moon really on that side? Does the sun really is a star? I start making a lot of notes here and there, and then I start researching. And from my research is that I start, like, adding to it, and probably ripping it apart a little, just to be able to find exactly what is the real part of it, because I do believe that all fables and folktales, myths and legends, they originated from something that was actually true.
Those are great observations. And I kept thinking, well, Carolina's the James Bond of American storytelling.
I would love to be called
Or the
that.
Sherlock Holmes or whomever's there, to look at it as discovery. And what was really curious was that you follow an insatiable curiosity to move story. And it's funny because in my search now, I read a short story about a person running against death, and it's a Japanese story. And it was a beautiful story. So I started doing the research, and I'm like, I'm real curious about this. And then found out, I want to tell this. This is part of the longest epic of Japan ever written, one of the first stories. And I'm like, whoa. And then I found out this story had taken all kinds of liberties, and I really shouldn't tell that version at all. But I wanted to be curious, and now it's like a huge epic journey. So, we have to disseminate. What I loved also is that you said that you would lift genre in the sense that maybe it was written as a romantic tale, but why can't it be a spy adventure where we hear, because it's there, Nobody told a folktale and said, this will only be in the romantic genre when it's in the library. But instead, you explore discovery over correctness. We need to be authentic. We need to represent the tale. We don't want to draw on misconceptions. But at the same time, I hear you saying, this story is calling out to me, and that's why I need to tell it. And I also hear you saying, this section of the story is calling out to me. Now, that's not something we get overnight. That insight is not something we get overnight. I know that you studied at East Tennessee. I didn't get my master's there. I did get a master's in storytelling, but it was with East Tennessee and the University of Akron. So from the study of storytelling, or even just from the experience of being out there, how has your shift in thinking changed so that you're moving to where you are now? Because we talked a little beforehand.
I would say that there's a couple things, and I don't want to forget them, so I'm gonna name them and then I explain them. The first one is I really like this is a course that was on the psychology of stories.
Hmm.
And the second thing is that while doing the masters is when I realized the need for Latin American stories. So I feel that I probably would have never made that realization, or at least not that easy, if I hadn't gone through the program. And a reason for that is because a lot of times they would ask us to go find folk tales and myths or legends, to practice and tell stories, right? But the assumption was always that you would go find the Grimm tales, or what's the canon, what's known, and what people feel perhaps more comfortable, or etc. And that's one of I suppose my curiosity began saying, okay, well, what about our stories? And a lot of times it was a lot of the references that they would make would be to these very known stories that are in folk tales or myths and legends, the European canon, or but I would never hear them referring to a story in Latin America. Like, do you remember? Like, a lot of times, you're gonna quote something fancy about, you know, English and English literature. You would say Shakespeare, that kind of thing. So in my head, it was like, where is our Shakespeare? Um, where are our brother Grimm's, the Grimm brothers? Where are ours? Anderson, where is our Hans Christian Andersen? Where is our etc.? And so that's when I decided, okay, I think there is a potential here for me to explore and find those those stories that are not visible, perhaps because no one has told them aloud. They have to be on books because we do have a history. We have histories, so many histories. They're
Powerful.
rich and complex, so they have to exist. But the question is, where are they? How? What? If the access is easy or not? And I want to work on that and put it out there. So that was one of the things that came out of going through the masters. Um, and the first one that I mentioned, it was the the course on the psychology of stories. And I really loved that one, although apparently I never got it right, according to our professor, but it's okay. But to me, it was very intriguing to realize that the stories have not only hidden messages, but they have many layers. And a lot of times, a story only reveals itself to you depending on where you are in life. So I'm gonna go with an example of a folk tale that I tell constantly with children. It's not even an adult's tale; it's just children's, and it happens with a lot of the other children tales I tell. The story, the first time I read it, is like, oh, this is fun, and this is gonna make the children's laugh. Yes, that's the first layer, entertainment. So then I start telling it, or I start like putting it together, and then I start telling it. And then once I see the kids' reactions, the adults' reaction, the audience reactions in general, and my reaction to their reaction, is that I began seeing a second layer of the story, something that I didn't figure it out or saw. And a lot of times it happens because a kid or someone in the audience says, oh, but there's a question. I'll give you an example. I had been telling a folk tale that is called Juan Bobo and the Flies, John the Silly and the Flies. And I had been telling it for a while, and I was like, yeah, I got this. I mean, this story is a scripted pretty much. There's nothing new to the story, I thought. And one day I was at a rural library, I can't remember where, but it was in Texas. And towards the end of the story, I think I finished the story, and there's a kid in the back, and he raised his hand. And I say, yes, do you have a question? And he gets really mad at me. And he says, what happened? You didn't tell us if Juan Bobo's mom forgave him. And I'm like, oh, geez, I never thought about it. I mean, there's like a link that I left hanging there. It's like a question right there. And for that kid, that was very important, because in the story, the mom is not that important. Technically, she's only asking some questions that will send the character in another direction, and that's her only importance in the story. But to that kid, it was extremely important that the mother would forgive him, and I had left that open. And in that moment, I understood that story had another meaning, a meaning of like parents not getting that upset to their kids over something so silly, or parents forgiving their kids. And so that story kind of shifted after that. And I saw in that moment other points, other parts in the story where that was very clear, that the kid was in a disadvantage comparing to the adults that thought that they were right all the time. And so the story changed it, and it showed me its deeper meaning. And every time I feel like this, I got it. This is it. There's nothing else that the story can show me. And then it just happens. Someone in the audience will see what I'm not seeing. The story opens its hidden meaning to that person, and that person serves as a bridge or a spoken person for the story, and let me know that, hey, I noticed this. And I was like, oh, I didn't. That's an extra layer of meaning, and that's psychology of stories. And so yeah, go ahead.
That's beautiful that it opens up. Again, you're responding to story. And from the point of view of someone who teaches storytelling and teaches the psychology of story, I think you got some of that there. I think you definitely. I don't think we have to worry, because the more that we dive into story, the more we're going to understand how important it is. I have recently been studying the storytelling in the brain, how we're wired for story. And I never thought I'd be the person that kind of researched this, but I'm just going to share one thing with you. There's a guy who has studied by the bloodstream of the brain, that when you're telling a story, like as soon as 4 seconds later or a sentence or two later, if the listener is really, really listening and you've impacted, their brain patterns will mirror the listeners. The listener will pick up on the teller. It still confuses me in a sense, but our brain couples because story is that powerful. That's what I'm basically saying. So when that kid was listening to your story, right,
Hmm.
that they're literally in sync with you as a teller. And only in the last 5 or 10 years has the research supported this. So everything you're saying is echoed by the psychology. But I don't want to keep you off track. So
No. I feel like it's a net. The story catches, like, spreads a net in a, yeah, you can see it when people start responding to what you're saying, and you start seeing their faces, or, it's like, oh, he's part of my net now, of this story net. If that
exactly.
makes any sense.
And there's a social scientist called Paul Zak who basically showed a story about a person talking about their dying son. And he literally could tell if you were going to react a certain way because stories build empathy, like unlike just giving you a list of facts. What I'm saying is that there's concrete research now that supports what you and I do. And that's why you've been invited to the University of
Yeah.
Oklahoma recently to kind of share that power. We've all, at least inherently, and what you're talking about is that, and more so than most people that I talk to, that you're really open to how story calls to you. You answer to the impulse of, this kid said, this is unfilled. It's like when I was telling Little Burnt Face, the Algonquin tale of Cinderella, and then something about it bugged me, and it was the fact that then we went to the water, and they put the water on the skin, and they could no longer see the scars. Well, in second grade, I went to school with a guy that a kiln had blown up, and his entire back and body was scarred from head to toe in second grade. And I said to myself, because we were in gym, and that's the time you had to be shirtless, if you were a boy. And you would see all those scars, and I remember everybody talking, and I'm like, if I told this story to him, would he feel the same way? So I got rid of that section so that somebody who had those scars didn't have to see the removal of scars to see beauty. Opening the story is extremely important. And I don't want to cut you. You is there more you want to say about your transitional shifts in the story?
Um, all I can say that is coming to my mind. I don't know why. Maybe it's a story that wants to talk. They're a little stubborn when they want to be,
Oh
like,
yeah. The Korean
um,
folktale where they're stuck in a bag and they have to get out, or
yes,
they'll
yes.
get you.
Tell me, tell me, tell me. I was at the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival,
Oh
and the
sure,
first
great
story I
festival.
told, yes, in September, and the first story I told at the festival was one that is called I call it the Three Magic Shawls. And it's a story that requires a lot of participation of the audience. And I've realized that a lot of times when you incorporate the participation of the audience, the active participation, because technically they are participating as they are sitting and listening to you, right? But it's a passive participation. But when you ask for that active participation, is when you get to see much better how the story unfolds its layers, how much the story wants you to play with it, how much the story wants to get to the people. And that story, I had fun before with that story, and mostly I've told it to fifth graders or middle school kids. And this was my first time telling it to adults. And I was like, I'm pretty sure after this, people are gonna be like, "Oh my gosh, she's like a storyteller for children or something, right?"
Well,
Oh my
an
god,
honor, by the
we
way. That's an honor.
and we had so much fun. And I would say 90% of the people there were adults, because right after me was Bill Lepp. So he draws younger audiences too, but a lot of times is, young adults or adults. And
Sure.
so, of course, they were there mostly to see him, and I was just opening. And I told that story, and we had, I can't, I mean, I
I'm
was a
going to roll
little
you back
nervous.
just a little, Caroline. To
Yes.
open is truly a gift, and you don't know that some people weren't there to see you because you follow from tent to tent in Timpanogos, and they might have said, I want to hear one more story from Carolina. So
Yeah,
don't.
well, that was what I was hoping after that, that I would blow their minds. And what it ended up happening was that we just had so much fun. And I ended up improvising because the story opened that door for me in that moment.
Nice.
Um, uh, to see people participating, shouting aloud, laughing, making faces at the things I was saying. It just, that's when the story feels like, yeah, play with me more. Look at, we're connecting. These people are in. And so that's one of the things I like very much about when I'm putting together a story. I try my best to sometimes find an opportunity to have some participation, because when I allowed to open that door, a lot of times is one of the best ways for the story to grow uh, bigger and farther. Like the fact that I'm here at the Butte, this is I'm opening a door myself, and you guys open me a door, but I could have said no. Of course, I could have said no. I'm
What?
scared of being coach, right? But this is a door of, I'm letting you get come into my process, and provide me feedback. And when we are doing that participation with the audience, we are actually allowing them to be themselves and provide feedback in their own way. And when they do that is when I always tell people, we're telling the story together. I'm not the one telling the story, just me. I'm just like a spokesperson or a bridge or a megaphone, I suppose, for the story. But the only way to tell stories is if we do it together. So I'm gonna need you, and I just don't need only your attention. I need you to tell the story with me. And to that is to, protest the story, laugh at it,
Yeah.
uh, say something aloud. I'm totally fine with that, and I love it, because that's when I realize, okay, the extra potential that the story has, and how much the story wants to grow. I feel stories are their own entities.
It's a living thing. It really is.
Hmm.
And I so appreciate you echoing that. And so when our first step is to go to, I think I say this in every debut interview, but to go to a solitary desk and try to create life without word dancing is what I call it. Word dancing is dancing in the world that you're creating. Um, before you ever go to that paper. You got to be ready. You got to do the detective work, to borrow your words. You've got to search, but you've also got to play and talk to other people. And I hear you saying, "Hey, protest this story. Show me where it doesn't work. Show me where it does." And Jamie Campbell, who will be on, said, no one's going to be hurt. You don't have a machine gun. You don't, you're not staving off, but it's a beautiful moment that's alive, as you say, between you and the teller. And so we shouldn't always practice from the page before we practice out loud and dance it out. What do you think?
I totally agree. I remember one little anecdote. I was once telling a story. It's a Mayan myth. And there's this character who technically is kind of a villain, but he's more like a trickster. And his name is Chak. But anyway, I told the story, and then a good friend of mine came and say, Carolina, I feel like when you say Jack, it kind of sounds like Jack. And for a moment, it made me think that the character was Jack and the Beanstalk. And then I got kind of confused. And so that was something very personal, because it was talking about how I'm pronouncing something. In as a foreigner, someone that, I mean, I still sometimes struggle with English. I even struggle with my own Spanish, but uh, having a correction on pronunciation, or she making me realize that there's a potential for, people getting lost on one thing that I said. What I decided to do with that is I brought that comment into the story.
Ah,
And so what I normally say is, and his name was Jack. And I'm going to make a parenthesis right here because I did not say Jack. No, I did not say Jack and the Beanstalk. And everybody laughs. And I say, that guy is a trickster. But the one I'm talking about is Jack. And he's spelled Chac. And everybody laughs at it. And so I turned that moment, which was, a feedback moment. And I brought it into the story. And it turned out to be a joke. And
and
it
it's
always
alive.
works.
Exactly. But
Yes.
I have to give it an aside. As a person who wrote a book called You Don't Know Jack,
I know.
a storyteller goes to school. I feel close to Jack. So in many ways, Jack's still in that story for me. I'm just kidding. No, I want to meet Jack too.
Well, they both are tricksters. So that I think that's an extra layer that I'm giving people in that moment. Like, a trickster, one of the most famous tricksters in the European and even American tradition of folk tales is Jack, right? Uh, but hey, there's another one, and we have many others, right? And here I'm presenting you another one, and he is not like this Jack, but it kind of sounds like that. But he's a different type of trickster, and let me tell you more about him, etc., etc.
Thanks.
So it kind of serves as an association too. Because it's like an association of tricksters too. Like the Tricksters
Well,
Association. They're
I,
probably friends.
I wrote a story called Cousins of the World, and it's where Anansi meets a trickster and Coyote and Iktomi and maybe Jack.
Well, now you have to include him there.
Exactly. And that's the whole thing. And I think that's a theme. We don't have to look for themes in this, but you're talking about the integrated nation of story as a collective whole. That one story leads to another, and it moves us, and we answer the story only when we're in a state of readiness. Sometimes people, I listen to them, they're like, I've been working on this story for 30 years. I can't get permission. And I'm like, there's a lot of other stories out there that you probably can get permission. Or they say, oh, such and such passed away, and I wish I could have told them stories. Or I wish I could have heard their stories. And I said, did they know anyone? Could you talk to their neighbor? Could you talk to... We think sometimes that the stories aren't reachable, but you're the detective. I'm learning from you. So
Oh no, they are.
let me ask you, and you've already said it, so why debut?
Because I love coaching, I love feedback, and because to build a story, to put it together, to showcase it, it doesn't require one person. It requires many. Just as the story has many characters, uh, when you want to tell it and put it together, it works so much better with the insights of those around you. The story stands stronger when it has been built uh, with different materials, um, with when it has different walls and columns, right? And not everybody and not everything put it. Not just one person put them all together. To build a house, you need a whole team of people, right? Two or three or four, right? Putting it together. The story is exactly the same thing because the story is it's its own universe. It's a house, and it has its bathrooms, and it has an attic, and it has a basement or garage. Uh, it has all those things. So it does need a community, even if it's a small community or not, uh, to put it together if it wants to be strong and hold together and stand there for a long time and be inviting to others, because not every house is inviting, but mi casa es tu casa, and a house that is ours is inviting to everyone, and it's not threatening, and you can come in and just stay in the living room or in the kitchen, or you can enjoy every aspect of the story. And that's what happens when people listen to a story. Sometimes they enjoy more the living room of the story, the backyard, which are all the little meanings that connect specifically with each person. So that's why I'm in debut, because I want your feedback, and the story wants your feedback.
I love it. I love it. Can you tease us a little bit on what you might tell? Don't tell the whole thing or I'll cut you off.
Oh, okay. This is a story from a Spanish writer. Her name is Angeles Vicente. She lived in Argentina for a while. In Argentina, this is the late 19th century, early 20th century. She became a Mason, and she was very drawn to science fiction, fantasy, and spiritualism. Um, and so she wrote this story called Vultures. And it's a story of a man that is led by a mad scientist.
Okay, we're stopping here. That's just a teaser. We want them to come and find out more. It sounds
Yes,
actually very provoking and inviting. I
it
want to
is.
brag on Carolina. I had the great pleasure of editing Tomorrow's Storytellers Today, where we worked with storytellers that were 35 and under, or that they had, and or worked with that audience. And she wrote about agency and advocacy, and really talking about how we talk about others, especially in the migrant community. And we want that will probably be on sale by next month. Hopefully, we're waiting. We wrote it a while ago. If you want to say a couple things about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I'm actually looking forward to reading the whole book. I want to
So
read
am I.
everything else, all the things that the other contributors wrote, because we had that other event past July, and I got to meet other three writers. And I feel like when you read that book, you're going to take not one step further in your storytelling career or practice, but you're going to take like 10 or 20 forward. Um, Specifically about what I wrote is, uh, I would say that is it is very important to be careful when you choose the stories. I feel all stories want to be told. Of course, there are cultures that are more sensitive about who tells their story. But when we're talking about the stories from cultures that are now considered immigrants, but probably 10, 50, 100 years ago, they were not. They were having a good time in their own lands. But today, tables turn or things happened, and now they are in another position. And I feel that it's important to tell their stories, but not necessarily from a very sad perspective, um, but from a more enriching type of perspective. We shouldn't romanticize uh, journeys, but we shouldn't judge them. We should just be curious about it. Walt Whitman said that, right? Be curious, not judgmental. So
Also said, I
we,
found my barbaric yelp across the world, which we need to do that in regards to those stories, don't we?
yes, it mainly is because I do believe that what goes around comes around. And if we are now having a good time in our lives, we have security, stability, there's going to be a moment in our lives where we may not have it. And we might, for an instant, be in the position of those who are dispossessed, those who have to leave everything behind and move in, but not necessarily because they are going through that means that they are, saints or they are victims. Every person has its own story, and there's nothing necessarily evil or saintly about it. We're just humans, and those stories need to be told, but we have to also be careful how we tell them. um, we To me, it's important that people realize that this is something that can happen to anyone, um, and especially now that climate change is hitting everyone. So there's already happening. I mean, there's a lot of people in California that are moving to Texas and other states because of the wildfires, and there's other people across even the U.S. that are having to move. People in Louisiana with all those hurricanes. So they are becoming immigrants in a way, migrants. They're still in their same country, but they're still losing their homes. um, they they're losing not only you know things, but they are losing people. And that's the exact same journey as those that are coming from other countries. The difference is that they're probably a different color, or that they just don't speak English. But the story itself is just a story of dispossession, is a story of losing, is a story of transformation, is a story of walking through darkness and search for the light.
You said earlier that when you're first telling stories, sometimes it just has that entertainment appeal. The same when we're talking about cultures and communities. We need to avoid lampooning or cartooning or just telling one side of one section of one story. I mean, that's a whole culture that we're diving in. And we're never going to be able to be the ambassadors of the entire culture, but we
No.
can give authenticity. And your article reflects that. The other thing that Carolina does many things, but she is a podcaster. I didn't think she expected to be in science fiction and fantasy, but I'll ask her to speak on that for a minute.
Well, you mentioned I'm a podcaster, and that is very true. I've been producing a bilingual podcast called Tres Cuentos, which means three stories. We are rebranding, so next year we'll have a different name. But at this moment, our latest season is dedicated to the beginning of Latin America's fantasy. And so Kevin, he participated in our second episode of that season. And you read a story that I know it was a little tough to read at times because it has a lot of weird names. But we're trying to showcase Latin America's literature, and there's so much that is unknown, much to discover, especially here in the US, which is one of the reasons why the podcast is bilingual. Every episode is in English and Spanish because I want everyone to have access to it. There's Latinos that speak only Spanish. There are other Latinos that speak only English, second, third generations. There are other people that simply like literature, other people that are learning Spanish or English, and they can benefit from listening to the stories. But my main goal is to make our Latin American literatures available, accessible. That's what I want, to people to find our stories, see that we have fantasy, see that we have science fiction, that is not a thing that is only for just some selected European or American authors, because that's the canon. Normally, that's what you see. O sea, the big authors are, with the exception of the South African author that wrote these fantasy stories. I'm forgetting his name right now, but the canon of the great literature is still European or American. And I feel that the idea that people have of Latin America is just Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Borges, and that's about it, which is two dudes, two guys. But there's our literature is very rich, and it goes back centuries, and it's not only Spanish from Spain, but it's from all across Latin America. So we're showcasing um, different types of literature that perhaps people are not very familiar with. When you hear Latin American literature, you think of other things, but we do have fantasy, and it's pretty cool.
So we see that we're not just telling one side of a story or a single story. We're opening up so that we see more of a genre. Carolina is telling stories both for adults and kids. When's debut? It's on a special day this time.
Yes, it's on October 31st.
Which for some, that is Halloween. Doesn't mean we're telling
Yay!
ghost stories, but it might have a sneaky or who knows? Come, it might be spooky. It might not. It doesn't have to be, but it is on Halloween, so that's scary.
Yes, and it's the day before Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead.
Yes, just about to repeat. I know that, and you definitely, there's some wonderful folklore around that, as well, both in present and in past. And that's extremely important when talking about cultures as well. And as long as we're talking about it, there's the Singapore Hungry Ghost Festival, which I found out about, where you're in the middle of the street. I was in Singapore, and there's like makeshift, like a model car or money, stacks of money. And then when you ask them, there's one time a year that, and China has this as well, that opens up the difference between whatever's equivalent of heaven and hell. And you have to give gifts so that they don't come and get you. And if I'm getting that wrong, please let me know, because I'm learning, but that's what I was told from when I was in Singapore. So there's beautiful folklore around myth and spooky and all kinds of things.
That is.
Carolina Quiroga, we could talk forever, and I know that we will continue to talk, but right now I'm giving you the last word.
Okay. Well, all I gotta say is come to debut. It's gonna be amazing. The other tellers are bringing amazing stories, and I am gonna work very hard to present something pretty cool. It would be a story that I have never told, but I fell in love with that story. I think is a story that it has the potential to give you some goosebumps or make you think about um, what happens if your brain is not in your body anymore.